Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to George Croft's American Music Show. This week, we are diving into the life and career of Woody Guthrie, so stick around. All right, but first, I've got some dates coming up, so come on out and see me. We will be, October 16th is the big trip to Nashville. I'll be playing on the Ryman Plaza stage ahead of the Jason Isbell show, so that's going to be great. And then November 1st, I'll be at the R-Wagon Bar in Browns Valley for a Halloween party. And then November 11th, I'll be at Harrah's Northern California in Ione. So come on out and see me. We are also brought to you by Tyler & Co. Marketing, providing top-notch photography and videography services to Northern California. Tyler & Co. is your one-stop shop for social media content, product videos, commercials, promotional videos, and best of all, weddings and events. I dare you to take a quick scroll down their Instagram page at Tyler & Co. _marketing and tell me it doesn't look like a Hollywood production. If you want people to ask you who the executive producer of your wedding was, call Tyler & Co. If you want it to look like you got paid just to be in your wedding photos, call Tyler & Co. If you want the video of your first dance to look like it qualified you for the Screen Actors Guild, call Tyler & Co. And best of all, your future father-in-law is going to forgive you for everything. Everything. When he finds out how much money you're saving him on this wedding by using Tyler & Co. Marketing to capture your big day. So visit tylerandcofilms.com for all your photography needs. That's tylerandcofilms.com. Alright, so Woody Guthrie, his whole story here, as far as I can tell, digging into this, it's more of a commentary on American culture at the time, and less a story about his specific songs that he did. And it kind of, it has a lot of the same. We're sort of experiencing that part of history again in a weird, echoey way that I find, concerning and worth talking about. But anyway, so Woody's story starts off. First of all, the prelude to Woody Guthrie, his dad. It's a dark time in America. So in 1909, his dad, their house burns down, and so his dad was like a wealthy guy prior to the Great Depression. He had like a decent amount of money socked away. The family was pretty well off. And they're in Oklahoma. So this is kind of, the culture in Oklahoma at the time was not great because his dad was present for, if not directly involved in, a pretty famous lynching at the time, like right before Woody's born here, and kind of goes on to be, like, he's a card-carrying member of the KKK here as time goes on. So Woody is born into that, while also Woody's mom, pretty early in the story here, she's experiencing symptoms of Huntington's disease, which at the time she was just crazy. They didn't know, she wasn't diagnosed with Huntington's when she was acting this way. It was just she was an erratic person. And so Woody's born into this, and pretty early on, tragedy is just hunting this family. There's a weird through line in this whole story with fire. Like there is something following these people in this whole timeline here, because so in 1909, before Woody's born, the family house burns down. So that's on the mind of everybody, and who knows. My suspicion is that these things are all related. But so the family home burns down in 1909. And then 1911 is when his dad is involved in that lynching. Her name was the lynching of Laura Nelson, and which is I guess a relatively famous part of history there. And so then Woody's born a year later in 1912. Now, like I said, just a chaotic thing to be born into here. And So 1915, his dad is like really rip-roaring in the KKK. So as he's a young kid, he's got this like pretty extremist dad and a pretty, mentally ill mom is kind of his world. So, and then in the 1920s, I think just before, it might have been just before Woody was born here. I'm not exactly sure on the timeline here, but he had an older sister that dies in a fire. Now, the story around that is super weird. It depends on, I've heard different people give different interviews about exactly what happened there, but Woody's other sister tells the story that his older sister Clara had, she wanted to go to school, but her mom wasn't going to let her go that day for whatever reason. And she made some comment about, if I don't get to go to school, I'm going to kill myself. And, but that didn't stop their mom from just telling her, no, you're staying home for whatever reason. And so she does get forced to stay home. And then something happens where that girl lights herself on fire. Now that's either, one version of the story is she was ironing using coal oil for heat and like something spilled on her and it caught her dress on fire and she's burned, accidentally. The other version of it is she said she was going to kill herself if she had to stay home from school that day and she lit herself on fire. Like that's also a possibility, which just gutted Charles, Woody's dad. Because there's this, and it was pretty brutal. Like he's at somebody else's house. He gets word his house is on fire because the house caught on fire after. So like he comes running back to his house and finds his daughter still standing and conscious, but burned all the way, like a full burn victim here, but she's still like in shock and talking. And he kind of like, he can't touch her because she's like so severely burned. And, she ends up dying in the hospital a couple of days later. So there's like I said, the older sister sort of connects that to her mother's Huntington's disease, which is like if her mom hadn't been, suffering from that in whatever way, she would have let Clara go to school and that wouldn't have happened. I don't know. That's what the other sister says. So I don't know how true that is. But anyway, so that's tragedy number one. So then, a few years later, so Woody's born. A few years later, Charles gets severely burned. Now, again, a couple of different stories. One version of the story is he's working underneath a truck. Gasoline spills on him. He gets out from under the truck, kind of forgets about that part, lights a cigarette, and it burns him. Well, his face was not burned. His chest was burned, and like everything from the neck down, apparently. But his face and his hair, like I guess from the neck up, he was fine. But he always maintained that story that I was working on the car and I got gasoline on myself, struck a cigarette, and that's how it happened. But here we are with the other sister again saying what she believes happened is he was laying down sleeping, and their mother, who is losing her mind because she has Huntington's, pours gasoline on him while he's laying down and lights him on fire, which would kind of explain him laying down being on fire, sort of explains why his face isn't burned. But he would never, according to her, he never admitted that their mom did that to him. And so his version of the story is it was an accident. The daughter's version of the story is mom's going crazy and she lit him on fire. So that happens in 1927 when Woody is 7 or years old or something like that. Now, pretty quickly thereafter in 1929, it gets bad enough that his mom gets committed to an insane asylum. And so when Woody is like 9 years old, he's got these memories of going to visit his mom and she doesn't recognize him at all. So there was one interaction where he goes in, he's with her for a couple hours the whole time. She has no idea who he is. Then right at the end, she's sort of like, oh, you're Woodrow. Like that. And he gets this kind of lucid goodbye moment with his mom. And then he leaves and the family moves. Charles picks the family up and they leave. And they leave her in this insane asylum. She dies there a year later or something. So for a young kid like that, he's this has got to be, I mean, home life could not have been awesome with all of that going on. And so that's, that all happens. That all happens just in time for the Dust Bowl to hit and completely ruin everything. So his dad is one of these people, and when the Great Depression hits and the crash of the 1920s and all this stuff, like, it cleans them out. Like, they're victims of the stock market crash, and in 1929, I think is what it was. And so they're financially destitute. And then you add in the Dust Bowl, which could not have been timed worse. So to go on a little ecological side note here, the Dust Bowl is this crazy man-caused catastrophe. We're basically like, it's a giant accumulation. It really does kind of start like post-Civil War in the push westward. And then in the early 1900s, the sharecropping industry popping up, and everybody's trying to, make a living on these small farms. Well, farming practices at the time this is where you start getting a lot of like people tilling up their fields every year, which had not been a thing on the Great Plains ever throughout history. So what you do is you cut the roots out of all the native grasses that were normally, like, the wind was always there and droughts were always there, but the grass had deep roots that kept the dust down, and that's sort of like how the landscape survived. You get a bunch of people in there cutting the roots off every year and making giant, open tracts of row crops and stuff. Then a drought hits and everything dies. Everything dies, the wind picks up and starts blowing dust everywhere. And to the point where it's like, it's swallowing buildings. Like, there's pictures of cows standing on the roofs of barns, and like, people having to like sweep their houses out and shovel dirt out of their house like a couple times a day just because the wind is just packing dust into places. And it's apocalyptic. And when you go back and look at pictures of the Dust Bowl, it is unimaginable the level of destruction that comes from this drought. So, and it's unmanageable. So these people all abandon their farms and they move west. And as people move west from the Dust Bowl, they're landing in California, which was not experiencing the same drought. There were jobs available, but you get set up for a pretty nasty societal problem where the people that are already there, like, it was a state-to-state conflict the way that we have nation-to-nation movement conflicts right now. Like, the way that, like, migrant workers from outside of the United States coming in is like, people feel a certain way about that. It was exactly the same way in the 30s about people coming from Oklahoma and, Arkansas and all these other places going to California. Which floods the job market, then labor becomes cheap, and now nobody can make a living, and it's a whole thing. So this is a very, 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 very tough time in America. And this is where Woody cuts his teeth. He's having all these experiences, working all these jobs, and, riding freight trains and kind of doing the hobo life. And this is kind of where he comes into his own through the 1930s here. And he starts getting a bit of a reputation as the traveling song guy. And just to be clear, Woody does not experience the type of success that later people, like, there's no track for him. There's no like record companies knocking down his door or anything. He's performing shows eventually, but it's not the same track to success that we see these other people achieve. Now, as if all of that was not enough for Woody Guthrie, as we all know, at the end of the 1930s, here comes World War II. Now, in America, at the end, between World War I and World War II, America was experiencing a lot of the same, conversations that Europe was. This is like the communist movement is boiling to the surface. The fascists are getting going in Germany, and there's this whole, that conversation is happening here at home also. And you have the entire middle class of America that has just been violently displaced from their, way of life through the Dust Bowl and just the Great Depression and everything else. So it is a tumultuous and chaotic environment to be in here. And Woody Guthrie finds himself having more in common with the communist movement than anybody else, which a lot of people did back then. And he gets, and like all good folk artists, he's very outspoken about his beliefs, and he gets to be pretty dang involved with the communist movement, to where he's like, at one point because he would write articles and columns for newspapers, and which he did for a communist newspaper for a while there. And his songs were very, like, they were meant for the working class of America, the working man kind of thing, and written through the lens of how just under attack the middle class was from this, like, elite class at the time. And this is where, so in here he writes "This Land Is Your Land," which now if you listen to, it's easy to be like, oh, this land, like, it's a nice, happy song. That song was an answer to Irving Berlin's "God Bless America," which I think Woody was trying to make more of the point of that the land is for everybody. And it was much more written in the words to that song. If you actually go back and read them and listen to the words of the whole song, it is more about, like, the collective ownership of things and, like, the health of the collective, and not just fencing each other out of stuff, and kind of, there's some communist, ideology buried in there, which gets him into trouble later. But anyway, so World War II cracks off, and Woody finds himself, he's in the Merchant Marine. He joins the Merchant Marine, which, when you hear that, you would think, oh, that's less dangerous. No, it's not. Because when you're in the Merchant Marine in World War II, you're not a combatant, but you are riding on ships that are a prime target for German attack. Like, because they're shipping men, equipment, food. They're the supply lines going back and forth across the Atlantic. And then they find themselves, like, Woody Guthrie is aboard 3 different ships when they get hit by torpedoes during this time. So I think the first one, was they were off the coast of, like, South Carolina or something. They were, like, pretty dang close to America when they get, the first one was they hit a mine in the ocean, and, were able to make it back to port. And then probably the most, intense one of these is he ends up in England. He's on one of the supply ships that's, like, running men and gear back and forth after the invasion at Normandy. So once the beachhead is established, we're now trucking in men and supplies to mainland Europe, and Woody Guthrie is aboard the boats doing that. And at one point they get struck by a torpedo, and the ship almost does not make it back to England. But like I said, so he survives that deal. Now, this is where you start to see his Huntington's disease start showing, because Huntington's disease, it's hereditary and it's nasty. So his mom had it. One of his other sisters dies from it eventually, and it is eventually what kills Woody Guthrie. But so he starts to have symptoms of that. And between that and his communist leanings and stuff, he starts running into some trouble with the government here pretty quick. So all of this, like, this whole time, he's armed with his guitar and his songwriting skill, and he's constantly singing, he's constantly writing songs, he's constantly talking to people. He sees himself as that's his role, is to, like, kind of be involved politically for the communist movement in this way. He would later get kind of ambiguous about it and say, like, he's not, like, an official member of the Communist Party, but he did a lot of legwork here. Like, he might as well have been. And so he ends up, so he gets out of the Merchant Marine. He ends up in the Army for a second, but then they boot him, and I think it's because of his Huntington's disease, also probably because of his communist sympathies. And so he has this weird exit from the military at the end of World War II, where it's not a very clean break. So he ends up, back in the States in 1940. So, this is where his music career kind of does start to pick up, is 1940 when he's, had his exit from the military. And he starts taking on work. This is where he's doing a lot of he gets back to the column writing and cartoon stuff. And, but he's also playing his music. And this is where, I think Pete Seeger is his friend that he meets and kind of befriends. And, let's see here. I had another note here about that. Let's see here. Yeah, so he writes "This Land Is Your Land" in 1940, and then also 1940 is a busy year for him. So he writes "This Land Is Your Land." He performs at the John Steinbeck Committee benefit for farm workers, and yeah, so this is where he meets Pete Seeger, and the two of them kick off a friendship that lasts, through the decades here. And this is all through this stuff here. You start to see, and through his marriages that are coming up, and kind of some of the trouble he gets himself in, that in interviews when people are asked directly, "Did you like Woody?" they say no. Like he was a mean dude, and like he was kind of a narcissist, and he was kind of this. They kind of trash him a little bit. But then they say, but the artistry was undeniable. His ability to convey emotion through words was just like, that's what kept people around. And yeah, I mean, it's all through this time here where he is making and breaking relationships left and right. And, but he's getting some pretty good work going here. He's joining bands. He's, let's see here. This is where also too, like he starts getting really heavy, not just in the pro-communism stuff. At the end of World War II, quickly develops into anti-fascism, which is like, we're splitting hairs here, but that's where his mind goes. And this is not like modern day people that call themselves anti-fascists are a joke compared to Woody Guthrie, who was surviving actual torpedo attacks from actual fascists during World War II. Like this guy was 100% serious about this. So when he makes a white sticker that he puts on his guitar that says "This machine kills fascists," that's where he's coming from. It's like a legit, during the conflict, world shaping happening all over the place, and that's the stance that he takes. And but that doesn't keep him out of trouble, because this is where we start going through like the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and the whole thing is coming up here. So like it's a tough time to have those political leanings. Let's see here. Yeah, like I said, he does, it affects his exit from the military here. So the 1945, after the end of the war, he gets married. Now, we're kind of bouncing around a little bit here, but so he marries a woman named Marjorie, and they have a daughter. Now, again, so this is 1946. And when his daughter was, I think she was little. She was like 3 or 2. Here we go again with this weird fire demon that is following this family around, because Woody goes downstairs to get cigarettes, and somehow I've seen some things blame a lamp, like an oil lamp that she spilled over on herself. Other things called it an electrical fault in the apartment. However it happens, by the time Woody comes back upstairs, that little girl is on fire and she dies a couple of days later. So, yeah. And that, by all accounts, is where that really is the first time that tragedy seems to affect Woody in the way that you would think it would. He'd been very stoic and very cold and very kind of shut off up to this point. But one of his friends tells a story about them like walking on the beach at Coney Island soon after that had happened, and Woody just throwing himself into the sand and howling for like 5 minutes or something. Just completely lets himself break down emotionally. He's just full emotion dump on the beach at Coney Island. And then he gets up, puts his face back on, and doesn't talk about it again. He just packs that up and keeps it going. And But yeah, like I said, just, man, whatever it is with fire in that family, it just keeps showing up. And but he has other children, and obviously that marriage is doomed to fail here pretty quick. Let's see here. So his daughter Nora is born in 1949, shortly thereafter. And then in 1950, his Huntington's disease really starts to take off, and this is where his behavior gets erratic, and he starts being, like, pretty hard to deal with, to the point where, you know, that ends his marriage to Marjorie. And there's this weird time here where he starts, like, his Huntington's flares up or whatever. I mean, he's just behaving in a way that is detrimental to his relationships. He, you know, marriage ends. He ends up in, like, the hospital briefly for that, but then he gets discharged, then he gets married again, has a couple more kids. That's where Arlo Guthrie is born, I think in 1947, or 48, I think is when Arlo's born. So, and actually I think Arlo was born to him and Marjorie. I think their marriage hadn't ended yet at that point. And let's see here, 1953, he's hospitalized for like quite a while here at Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey. And that's when, you know, oh, okay, yeah. So Marjorie was his second wife. She divorces him in 1956. So, and the rest of this is kind of, we're talking a lot about this guy's personal life just because it's so, like, the whole time he's writing ballads, he's performing, he's widely recognized as a, you know, a amazing artist, but he has tied himself to some causes that are giving himself trouble. His physical health is deteriorating way faster than success is making up for it. His relationships are falling apart all around him. So he's not this, like, star character that you might have thought he would be at this stage in his story. But on the folk scene, he kind of is. And it kind of leads into, like by the end of his life here, he's in the hospital, and he's getting visited by up-and-comers on the folk scene. This is where Bob Dylan goes and sees Woody Guthrie in the hospital and is, like, playing songs for him. And I think he did that a few times. Like, it wasn't just a one-time thing, I don't think. And and there were a couple others, like Joan Baez, I think, is another one. And then I might have just said that name wrong. But anyway, so, but if you listen to Woody Guthrie's music and then you listen to Bob Dylan's music, you go, oh, that's where he got that. Like, that same kind of just poetic but kind of chaotic rhyming structures and just kind of throwing words wherever he feels like if they work, and more about telling a story and more about, you know, conveying an emotional, you know, message more than anything. And the reason, like, my brain grabbed onto this because Woody Guthrie was what I think most folk artists want to be when they take political stances and when they kind of get involved in the weeds on that front with different causes and things. Like, they're, you know, even when we get into future characters, like the same way that, like, Chris Christopherson got super involved with, you know, different political causes and stuff, I think Woody Guthrie sort of, he's the first folk artist to tie those two things together to be, like, a cultural icon and a political activist, which you didn't see a lot of before this, like, if any. And he had that sort of attitude, which is good for taking stances where he was just like, he didn't care what anybody thought. He had his beliefs and he was going to tell you about them, and he might have even been a little bit gruff about it. Because like I said, like I found many an interview where people do not talk about Woody Guthrie the man as this, like, nice jovial character. They're like, he was hard to deal with, and he was a pretty gruff guy. But yeah, like I said, it's, what scares me about it is that what I believe were very serious political happenings of his time and the stances he was taking and the beliefs that he carried were brought on by these world events that were fully different than what we have now. But you see a lot of the same energy. You see a lot of the same, you know, I think when people take stances now, they think that they have the same conviction that Woody Guthrie had, but I don't think they really do. I think it's a tough tough landscape nowadays. But the tradition of being a folk icon and a political activist starts with this guy. And, and he did his absolute best. And that being said, I mean, like I said, if you just look at the art, it holds up, man. And the stories, all of his stories, not all of them, but a lot of his stories are like specific to the Dust Bowl era and just talking about the plight of the working man and that phase of America interrupted by the Dust Bowl and World War II in the shadow of corporate greed and the stock market tanking and, the just evaporating of the American middle class. He was knee deep in all of that stuff. And and to his credit, he took no steps backwards when it came to his beliefs and his, convictions. So, and then, like I said, his son Arlo, who's, working today, Arlo goes on to have his own cool career and his own, he comes from that, line of tradition. Arlo Guthrie ends up, in his story, he ends up in Jim Croce's house that we talked about, like when Jim and his wife were just hosting these weird parties that like random people would show up to and turned out to be big stars later. Like that was like the James Taylor, and I think Bonnie Raitt was there, and Arlo Guthrie was, a big part of the Jim Croce story, and so he's connected to Woody. So just a cool step in the story of American music, but like I said, it's not a simple one, and it's full of tragedy and just kind of watching humans navigate gigantic world events like that it's interesting to look back on. And then it's interesting to hear, like all of that arise in Arlo's music, in Bob Dylan's music, in, everybody's music after that. He was so early on and so prolific that it's impossible to listen to American music without hearing the notes of Woody Guthrie in there. So that's Woody Guthrie. Thank you guys for listening, and we'll see you next week.